A revelation from the prosecutor in the Delphi double murders. Is someone other than suspect Richard Allen involved? We'll tell you what the prosecutor has to say about it and what happened at the latest hearing in the case. Richard Allen is accused of murdering Liberty German and Abby Williams in Delphi, Indiana, back in February of 2017. And there's been so much secrecy surrounding what led investigators to him because the probable cause affidavit in this case remains sealed at the request of Carroll County Prosecutor Nicholas McClelland. There was actually a hearing on Tuesday morning where this issue came up. McClelland asked the judge to keep the documents sealed. And big headline here, and I think we all suspected this. He said because there are other people or another person who may be involved in these murders. So joining me to discuss this is someone who was in the courtroom for Tuesday morning's hearing. He is Bob Motta. He's a defense attorney and also the host of Defense Diaries. That's a true crime podcast. So Bob, welcome to Sidebar. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Paint a picture for us about what it was like inside that hearing.
Small. It's a very quaint, beautiful old courthouse, but small. They had it on lockdown. In terms of law enforcement presence, it was a ton. They had just cops everywhere. So like from the first floor in terms of getting into the building, it wasn't too difficult. From the perspective of getting into the courtroom, it was small, no standing. And the bigger thing for people that are kind of in the media is that we weren't allowed to use phones. And that came down from a general order from the chief judge. So there would have been no live tweeting or anything like that of that nature. So it's small. You've got to get there early to be able to get in there. And you could just feel the tension in there, really. Obviously there are a lot of family in there, a lot of family and friends. So obviously with respect to what was going on today, and I think that there's just kind of that factor for lay people that they just don't exactly know what's going on. So everything seems terrifying with respect to, the fact that the defense had filed that 11th hour motion to set bail. So, when you're talking about the families and they hear that, they immediately think, oh, what, this guy's going to get out, so they don't understand kind of like how it interplays with the fact that the documents are sealed. So it was brief, but it was interesting for certain.
Sure. And that bail hearing, it's my understanding, will not be held until February 17th. So it's a ways off still.
It is. And, kind of the way that it interplays with the fact that the documents are sealed, and it's not just the probable cause affidavit, which obviously lays out the entire theory of the state's case against Allen, but it's also the charging documents. I mean, in theory, it sounds to me as if he's been charged with more than just the 2 counts of murder, but they have not released those. The only 2 charges they've publicly shared are the 2 counts of murder. I believe that there's going to be additional counts. And I kind of had to read that through the tea leaves a little bit, but I think that that'll stand to reason when it actually gets, unsealed, and it will at some point. And what was interesting is the fact that the judge was handed a redacted copy of the probable cause affidavit. So even Fran Gull herself did not see what the actual facts are. So in order for the bond, and another interesting thing in Indiana is that the burden in terms of there's a presumption that people get bail generally. Now, when it's a murder case, it's different. It's not typical for somebody to get bail. They're usually held with no bail. But when they filed that, it triggered the burden to be put on the state in order for them to show that they have strong evidence in order to keep it as a no bail, which they can't argue that motion. The state can't. They can't meet their burden unless they're saying the facts that they have. There's a case in Indiana that changed a 150-year-old law where it was always the defendant's burden to have to show why they should have bail set. Back in 2013, Fry v. Indiana, that changed it. It shifted the burden over to the state, which is like when you're trying to talk about the fact that the documents are sealed, the state's not going to be able to go into court to tell the judge what evidence they have until it's unsealed. So it's a really interesting way that that played out, and I think that Judge Gull probably set that out that far because she's going to stew on this. She's going to think about it. I mean, McClellan made some arguments that he's worried about the safety of potential witnesses that are named in the affidavit. So there's factors there that are at play. So it's pretty interesting.
But I had read some stuff, Bob, about that, and I read that apparently the witnesses' names are redacted, and the head of the ISP, the guy that's in charge of this, he had said apparently he had told one of the TV stations there in Indianapolis that he didn't believe releasing the probable cause affidavit would harm the investigation. So obviously, there's some disagreement there.
Yeah, definitely. And you're talking about Doug Carter, the
Right, Doug Carter.
superintendent.
Hmm.
Yeah. So yeah, he did say that unequivocally a couple of times that he didn't feel that the documents being unsealed would in any way, shape, or form harm the investigation. So that's a pretty strong statement coming from the superintendent of the Indiana State Police. I mean, like if I'm defense counsel, I'm probably calling him as a witness. In terms of getting it unsealed, the other thing that was at play today is obviously the media had filed a brief in support of having the documents unsealed. There's it's an interesting kind of dynamic that's going on with kind of the true crime community at large. I think there's a large portion that feels that they don't want the documents unsealed because they're afraid that it's going to somehow compromise the investigation. And and I can see it from the other side as well because I mean, public trials are public. Period. That's the Constitution. So constitutionally speaking, they're really rubbing up against each other in a way that you don't want to create a slippery slope where you have a case that is high profile like this. They don't want to screw it up. They don't want to have the investigation get damaged somehow because once the affidavit comes out, everyone's going to start speculating. I mean that's kind of what the big kind of the big concern is. So it's interesting.
Well, we certainly don't want people speculating and harassing witnesses. That's uncalled for. But if they believe somebody else is involved, and plus murder, let's face facts, that's the most serious charge you can face in our criminal justice system. So it would be nice if even just a redacted version of the probable cause statement would be released to the public, so people could have just a little bit, know a little bit about what led them to this
I
guy.
agree. I agree.
I mean, I'm a
I don't.
big open records person. I want,
Me too.
records to be
I'm a
public.
criminal defense attorney by trade, so it's like I'm big on transparency from the state, especially. I want to know now. Obviously, defense counsel got copies of the affidavit, they uh, basically made a statement after the hearing where they had said, "Oh, well, it was news to us that there was a potential, additional suspect." I think that was probably not completely true. I think all of us kind of knew when Carter gave the initial press conference and he said, "We're going to leave the tip line open." He left all the crumbs there for us to kind of know that maybe someone else is involved. So he may have been a little bit disingenuous, but there's a lot of cat and mouse that's going to go on in a trial like this.
Sure, and he did say that. I mean, that was my big takeaway from the press conference about the arrest, was the fact that they were saying this is not over yet. So the question is, and let me ask you this first before I move on to who the possible other person or people could be. It's my understanding from reading some news accounts that the defense attorney in this case said that the case is flimsy against Richard Allen. Your take on that?
So, like when you read the actual motion that was filed, I mean, it's a pretty boilerplate standard motion. He cites the language from actually that case that I was talking about, Fry versus State, where he essentially is saying, look, the evidence isn't strong and they're going to need more. And why that's why I was saying it's really an interesting interplay with respect to the fact that the documents are sealed because like typically it's the defendant who has to come in and say, this is why my client needs to have bond set. In this particular situation, it's the state who has the burden, who has to give the facts to the judge and say, look, this is what the case is. This is why you have to keep it at no bond. So, I've been doing this a long time, and as criminal defense attorneys, you're gonna say things that are gonna be overly broad, in terms to try to just kind of make the point. And additionally, they had to be extremely careful when they were drafting this motion because the records are sealed. It's not as if the defense could argue and put forth some 15-page bond motion where they're laying out the facts as to why this is weak, why this is weak, why it's not relevant to Richard Allen and things of that nature. They had to keep it as bland as humanly possible because they can't be put in a position where they are going to somehow reveal information that is in sealed documents. So it's interesting. The whole thing is pretty interesting how that's going to play out.
So let's talk about Keegan Klein. He's a guy who operated the Anthony Shots fake profile online to communicate with underage girls. And we've been told that he was talking with Libby German around the time that she disappeared. And now his pornography trial, child pornography trial, has been delayed. And they cited ongoing negotiations with prosecutors. So do we think that he's involved somehow?
I'm, so I mean, he's looking at 25 counts. This guy's got like a massive case that is pending against him. Part and parcel of that is anytime you have a defendant who is looking at what would probably end up being in excess of 50 years in prison on those types of charges, he's got to offer them something. So as of very recently, he went to the Indiana State Police and said, "Look, if you drag the river, the Wabash River in Peru, you're going to find a weapon and you're going to find a telephone that are related or directly uh, related to Abby and Libby's case." So they proceeded to do that for 5 weeks, and of course, they came up with nothing. I I flip flopped on this guy. I don't think that he's a legit, like, he just even physically, he doesn't seem like a guy who's out there doing things unless, like, I mean, physically, he seems like he's more of a computer troll type of guy to me. Like, that's my honest assessment of him. Whether or not it turns out to be a situation where there was some kind of procurement, where he maybe have would have set up the girls to show up to the bridge and had Richard Allen show up at the same time, that's a different story. I mean, that's not beyond the scope of reason. And in terms of him physically being there, I don't know that I buy that. It certainly could be a situation where he was a participant in drawing the girls to that area. But everything that I've read, the girls were going there anyway. But we don't know what goes on in the girls' snaps. I mean, they could have been talking to anybody. They could have thought they were meeting somebody else. So I mean, those are all things that we're all dying to know. There's certainly ways that it could happen where he is involved. And again, you've got a couple of girls that, in terms of controlling them, where you've got two humans with one guy, just physically that's tough to do. And Liberty was not like a small girl. She could hold her own, I imagine, because she was physically stouter than Abby. But it's um I think that there was probably a gun involved. I think that there were directions given by whoever, if it was just Allen alone, and at this point he's alleged. But and that's the thing. We just don't know what the evidence is.
Yeah, and we don't, and they were, they're girls, these are
Yeah,
kids. Well,
exactly.
Bob Motta, defense attorney and host of Defense Diaries, a true crime podcast. Thank you so much for coming on and for offering your expertise and your time and letting us know what happened in that courtroom today.
It was my absolute pleasure, and I hope to do it again.
And that's it for this edition of Law and Crime Sidebar podcast. It is produced by Sam Goldberg and Logan Harris. Bobby Szoke is our YouTube manager. Alyssa Fisher handles our bookings, and Kiara Bronson does our social media. You can listen to and download Sidebar on Apple, Spotify, Google, and wherever else you get your podcasts. And of course, you can watch it on Law and Crime's YouTube channel. I'm Angenette Levy, and we will see you next time.